Like if your kid comes home and they start talking about my truth, you know that they have been washed over with subjectivism and the culture. So, you know, you need to get into a discussion about that. And a lot of this question of objective and subjective truth is the outgrowth of a concept called postmodernism. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with postmodernism, but I'm old enough to remember when postmodernism started coming into the university. And it was kind of in the late 80s, early 90s is when the shift started happening. One theologian, Tom Oden, that I admire, said that postmodernism really came into the academy when communism fell in the late 80s. That was kind of his historical marker. But it's an important concept to understand because the culture in which we live now is just completely postmodern. I mean, all the way down to the children. Like this is no longer an academic idea. It kind of started out as an academic idea in the 60s, and it was actually a literary theory at first. And the literary theory was that interpretation of texts were subjective. And there's a very famous book by a guy named Stanley Fish called "Is There a Text in This Class?" And it's the idea that I could read something and Laura could read something and Tammy could read something, and we could all get different interpretations of that text. And all of our interpretations would be equally valid. I was in an undergraduate English class at Biola, and hopefully none of your children are listening because I don't want them to get any nefarious ideas. So we're sitting in class, I think it was like an American Lit class or something, and we were reading a poem. And we were all sitting in a circle, and everyone was going around interpreting the poem. And I sat there and thought, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, why are we doing this? This is just a huge waste of time. So I decided to be really creative and come up with a very unique and novel interpretation of the poem. And I interpreted the poem when it was my turn that it was all about sex. And it was actually describing sexual intercourse. So I sat there in my Biola English class and explained my interpretation. I think it was by John Donne, who's like this famous medieval poet. And so I interpreted a John Donne poem through the lens of intercourse. And the teacher, my professor, says, that's very interesting. What an interesting perspective. And I'm thinking, really? That's all I'm going to get? I'm not going to get a reprimand or like, you're out of your mind or what are you doing? No, it's very interesting. What an interesting interpretation. And that was when I knew that postmodernism was real because he couldn't critique my interpretation because that's what was meaningful to me. And this is what I mean by postmodernism started as a literary theory. Now, how that's trickled down into the culture in the last 30 years is now everything is relative, right? It's not just my literary interpretations are relative. Now I can have moral structures, that are relative. This is what's true for me. This is my truth. This is wrong for me. And we make morality completely relative. We make religion completely relative. This is the religion that's useful to me. This is what brings my life meaning and purpose, right? So we've taken something that at the academic level started out as a literary theory, has now become a full-orbed worldview for many people. And critical theory, if you've listened to any of me and Monique's conversations about the rise of critical theory is just an outgrowth of postmodernism, which was a literary theory in the beginning, and critical legal studies, which was a legal theory, and then it kind of added in some racial components, and you kind of homogenize it all together, and you get the current reality that we're living in. And so all of this stuff is sort of, Monique likens it to like being in a supermarket. Like you just kind of take some of this and some of this and some of these ideas, you homogenize it all together, and this is where we've ended up. So when we're reading about these concepts this week in all three of these chapters, the very idea that truth even exists is so out of step with our culture. Right? Now, technically, a technical postmodern will say, well, truth exists, but we can't know it. But how many people are really technically understand the technical definition of postmodernism? Because most people will say truth just isn't even a thing. But some people that are more sophisticated will say truth is out there, but we just can't get to it. We can't know it. We can't know it for sure. Other people will say, no, there's no such thing as truth. Everything is relative. It's just, cultural anthropology. It's just your culture, your conditioning, however you've been brought up. So these are subjectivism is a world view now. And so this is why it's very hard to, when we're in a conversation with somebody who's been so saturated by postmodernism, they may not even really understand that this is the water that they've been swimming in. This is, to use another analogy, this is the air they breathe. So just keep that in the back of your mind about what's happening. If you're interested in finding out more about postmodernism, I would recommend the book. It's called Postmodern Times. I used to use it as a textbook when I taught undergrads at Biola. It's very accessible. Now, the book is a little older. It's about 25 years old, but it's a very useful book, and it's actually helpful that it's older because some of us need to be reminded what the world was like 25 years ago and what the world was like before postmodernism was a thing. Oh, there's my beautiful husband getting that up for us on screen real quick. So yeah, Postmodern Times, A Christian Guide to Contemporary Thought and Culture. It's a really good, accessible, basic survey into postmodern thought. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper into some of those implications of what I'm talking about, that's a really good primer that I found very effective. My undergrads at Biola always enjoyed that book. So pretty accessible.